August 17th, 1943. 25,000 feet above Schweinfurt, Germany. The oxygen mask froze against Oberleutnant Heinz Knoke's face as he stared through his Messerschmitt's canopy at a sight that defied comprehension. German pilots like Knoke found themselves in an impossible situation. Barely 40 fighters scrambled from bases across southern Germany to intercept an aerial armada of staggering proportions. Through the crystalline air at altitude, 376 Boeing B-17 flying fortresses split between Schweinfurt and Regensburg appeared like a silver glacier flowing across the sky, their polished surfaces reflecting the morning sun in blinding sheets of light. Each bomber bristled with 13.50 caliber machine guns. The combat boxes flew in perfect formation, creating interlocking fields of fire that could throw up walls of lead at any approaching fighter. Knoke's Jagdgeschwader 11, along with elements from Jagdgeschwader 1 and Jagdgeschwader 26, faced mathematics that mocked human courage. 40 German fighters against hundreds of American aircraft. These odds, which would have been dismissed as Allied propaganda just months earlier, had become the daily reality for Luftwaffe pilots defending the Reich. What Knoke and his fellow pilots witnessed that August morning was not just an air raid. It was the physical manifestation of American industrial supremacy that would eventually drown the Third Reich. The transformation from German aerial dominance to complete annihilation happened with shocking speed between 1943 and 1944. When Wehrmacht forces had swept across Europe in 1940, the Luftwaffe ruled supreme. By August 1943, German pilots were experiencing a reversal so complete that many would later describe it as watching their world literally turn upside down. The scale of American bombing operations by mid-1943 had reached proportions that German military planners had never conceived possible. The Schweinfurt-Regensburg mission of August 17, 1943, officially designated Mission 84, represented a new evolution in strategic bombing. Colonel Curtis LeMay's 4th Bombardment Wing led 146 B-17 bombers against the Messerschmitt factory at Regensburg, while 230 bombers from the 1st Bombardment Wing struck the ball-bearing plants at Schweinfurt. These targets weren't random. Ball bearings were identified as a critical bottleneck in German war production, and the Messerschmitt plant at Regensburg produced nearly a third of all German single-engine fighters. The strategic thinking was clear. Destroy Germany's ability to produce fighters while crippling overall war production through ball-bearing shortages. German fighter commander Adolf Galland had scrambled every available aircraft. JG-1 Usau launched from Dielen and Schiphol, JG-11 from Jever and Oldenburg, JG-26 Schlageter from Lille and Wevelgem. The elite units of the Luftwaffe, holders of Knight's Crosses and Oak Leaves, men who had dominated the skies over France, Britain and Russia, now faced odds that rendered their skill and courage almost meaningless. The Germans had developed desperate tactics to pierce the bomber formations. Knoke himself had pioneered the technique of dropping bombs from fighters onto the bomber formations from above. On March 22, 1943, he had successfully destroyed a B-17 using this method, becoming the first pilot in aviation history to down an enemy aircraft with an air-dropped bomb. In his memoir, I Flew for the Führer, he described the experimental nature of these attacks and his determination to find new ways to break up the defensive boxes. But such innovations were mere pinpricks against the growing American presence. By October 14, 1943, Black Thursday, the situation had grown even more daunting. The second raid on Schweinfurt saw 291 B-17s crossing into German airspace. The Luftwaffe, in what would be remembered as one of its last great defensive efforts, scrambled over 300 fighters from 24 different airfields. Major Heinz Beer's 2nd JG-1 launched with their Focke-Wulf FW-190s armed with WGR-21 rockets. JG-11 flew with similar armament, their yellow Reich defense bands distinguishing them from JG-1's red markings. The German pilots achieved what seemed like a victory. 60 American bombers shot down, a 20.6% loss rate that forced the Americans to suspend deep penetration raids temporarily. But the cost was catastrophic for the Luftwaffe. 35 to 38 fighters lost, including irreplaceable veteran pilots. Hauptmann Wilhelm Ferdinand Wutz Galland, younger brother of Adolf Galland, was killed when his FW-190 was hit by defensive fire. These men represented hundreds of hours of combat experience that Germany could never replace. Each B-17G flying fortress carried formidable defensive armament positioned for maximum coverage. The combat box formation, 18 to 21 aircraft flying in mutual support, could bring devastating firepower against attacking fighters. This tactical innovation, developed through bloody experience, made frontal attacks suicidal and beam attacks extremely dangerous. German fighters possessed excellent individual capabilities. The Messerschmitt Bf 109G6 and Focke-Wulf FW-190A4 were superb aircraft, but reaching the bombers had become increasingly difficult. The introduction of the P-47 Thunderbolt with drop tanks extended American fighter escort range deep into Germany by late 1943. By March 1944, when P-51 Mustangs appeared over Berlin itself, German fighters found themselves fighting for survival before even reaching the bomber streams. German desperation spawned remarkable innovations. The Sturmgruppe concept involved specially armoured FW-190s that would close to point-blank range before opening fire with 30mm cannons. If ammunition was expended, pilots were expected to ram the bombers. These Sturmböcke attacks required extraordinary courage. Pilots essentially flew their reinforced fighters through bomber formations, sometimes literally chopping through wings or tails with their propellers. The fate of Germany's elite fighter units tells the story in microcosm. Jagdgeschwader 1 Oesau exemplified this decline. Named after Walter Oesau, who was killed in action on May 11, 1944, the unit hemorrhaged experienced pilots at an unsustainable rate. Oesau himself, with 127 victories, had been one of Germany's greatest aces. His death, shot down by P-38 Lightnings, symbolized the fate awaiting even the most skilled German pilots. Between Major Hans Philipp's death on October 8, 1943, after achieving 206 victories, and Oesau's loss 7 months later, JG-1 burned through commanders faster than they could be replaced. The unit would claim over 700 enemy aircraft during the war, but suffer 464 killed in action, 174 wounded, and 94 killed in accidents, casualties exceeding the unit's nominal strength. Jagdgeschwader 26, Schlageter, commanded by Oberstleutnant Josef Pips Priller, maintained the Channel front from 1940 through D-Day. Despite achieving impressive kill ratios in individual engagements, the unit suffered catastrophic attrition. Of 754 pilots who served with JG-26 during the war, 584 would be killed or wounded, a 77% casualty rate. By December 31, 1943, of 185 pilots assigned, only 107 remained available for operations. Jagdgeschwader 11, formed in April 1943, became specialists in anti-bomber warfare. The unit pioneered the use of BR-21 rockets, modified 21-centimetre mortar tubes that fired time-fused projectiles into bomber formations from 1,000 metres. During intensive combat periods, JG-11 claimed significant bomber kills, but these tactical victories couldn't alter the strategic reality. The Americans could replace their losses. Germany could not. The collapse of the Luftwaffe's training system proved more catastrophic than combat losses. The pre-war German pilot training program had been exemplary, requiring over 250 flight hours, including extensive aerobatics, formation flying, and gunnery practice. By 1944, this had collapsed to a mere 112 hours, often incomplete due to fuel shortages. The contrast with American training was devastating. U.S. Army Air Force pilots received over 300 flight hours before combat, arriving at units fully trained. German pilots by 1944 were arriving at frontline units barely able to fly their aircraft, let alone fight effectively. Johannes Steinhoff, one of the Luftwaffe's most successful pilots with 176 victories, described the tragic reality in his memoirs. "We received young men, boys really, who had perhaps 100 hours total flying time, maybe 10 hours on the Bf-109. We were supposed to make them combat-ready in 2 weeks. Most were dead within their first 5 missions." The statistics revealed the deadly cycle. In the first 6 months of 1943, the Luftwaffe lost 1,100 fighter pilots, 60% of its January strength. By 1944, monthly pilot attrition reached 25%. Fighter units were experiencing complete turnover every 4 months. Only commanders possessed meaningful combat experience. Most pilots had between 8 and 30 days of active service before becoming casualties. The Allied oil campaign delivered the death blow. Germany's synthetic fuel plants produced 124,000 barrels daily in early 1944, providing 92% of aviation fuel. These facilities became primary targets beginning in May 1944. On May 12, 1944, 935 bombers struck synthetic oil plants. The immediate impact was catastrophic. Production fell from 175,000 tons in April to 52,000 tons in June, 35,000 tons in July, and barely 5,000 tons in September. Albert Speer reported in July that 98% of all Axis fuel plants were out of operation. The irony was bitter. German aircraft production reached unprecedented levels, 39,807 aircraft in 1944, including 24,981 fighters. Monthly fighter production peaked at 3,031 in September 1944. But these aircraft sat idle, lacking fuel to fly them or trained pilots to operate them. Luftwaffe ground crews resorted to using oxen to move aircraft on airfields to conserve precious fuel. By November 1944, training flights were suspended entirely. Combat units operated on 10% of minimum required fuel. Pilots were restricted to 1 training flight monthly. By February 1945, synthetic fuel production had collapsed to 0.5% of early 1944 levels. The psychological destruction of German fighter pilots preceded their physical annihilation. Veterans who had entered the war as confident warriors gradually transformed into fatalistic survivors. Johannes Steinhoff captured this transformation in his memoir. In 1940, we were hunters. By 1943, we were the hunted. By 1944, we were simply targets. He wrote extensively about watching the gradual realization spread through fighter units that the war is already lost, and that leadership had abandoned every standard of responsible action. The crisis culminated in the fighter pilots' revolt of January 22, 1945. Germany's most decorated aces, Adolf Galland, Johannes Steinhoff, Günther Lützow and Hannes Trautloft, confronted Hermann Göring at the Haus der Flieger in Berlin. This unprecedented mutiny of the aces represented the complete breakdown of trust between frontline pilots and leadership. The pilots presented concrete grievances, continued accusations of cowardice despite impossible odds, incompetent operational leadership, and the dismissal of Galland as general of fighters. Steinhoff told Göring directly that the Me-262 jets should be released immediately for fighter operations to bloody the American bombers. Göring's response revealed complete disconnection from reality. He accused the pilots of treason and threatened execution. When shown wreckage of P-51 Mustangs shot down over Germany, he had declared it impossible, claiming the aircraft must have glided in from outside German airspace. Instead of executing the mutinous pilots, they were national heroes. Göring dispersed them. Lutzow was banished to Italy, Steinhoff forbidden from entering Luftwaffe airfields, Trautloft removed from his position. Operation Argument, known as Big Week, delivered the decisive blow. From February 20th to 25th, 1944, over 3,000 bomber sorties from the 8th Air Force, 500 from the 15th Air Force, and RAF night raids dropped 10,000 tons of bombs on aircraft factories. February 20th saw 1,003 American bombers, escorted by 835 fighters, attack multiple cities. The Luftwaffe could muster only fragmented resistance, perhaps 150 fighters total. Heinz Knoke, now Staffelkapitän of 5/JG-11, recorded the reality. We took off with 8 aircraft. 2 aborted with engine problems. Of the 6 that engaged, only 2 returned. The sky was full of Mustangs. By week's end, the Luftwaffe had lost 262 fighters and approximately 100 experienced pilots killed. Among the dead was Hauptmann Kurt Uben, holder of the Knight's Cross with 110 victories. The Americans lost 226 bombers and 28 fighters, losses they replaced within days. Big Week demonstrated definitively that American fighters now owned German airspace. March 6, 1944, marked the psychological end. 730 B-17 and B-24s bombed Berlin in daylight, escorted by 800 fighters, including P-51 Mustangs. For German pilots, seeing American fighters over the Reich capital shattered final illusions. The Luftwaffe mounted 83 sorties against this massive raid. The results were predictable: heavy German losses for minimal impact. German pilots watched their capital burn while unable to intervene effectively. Adolf Galland later wrote, "March 6, 1944, was when I knew absolutely the war was lost. Not because Berlin was bombed, it had been bombed before, but because it was bombed in daylight, with the Americans losing barely 5% while we lost 30%. The memoirs of German aces provide intimate testimony to this journey from supremacy to annihilation. These were the elite of the Luftwaffe, yet they found themselves overwhelmed by sheer material superiority." Adolf Galland wrote in The First and the Last, "Their element is to attack, to track, to hunt, and to destroy the enemy. Only in this way can the eager and skillful fighter pilot display his ability. Tie him to a narrow and confined task, rob him of his initiative, and you take away from him the best and most valuable qualities he possesses: aggressive spirit, joy of action, and the passion of the hunter." Johannes Steinhoff, who flew 993 combat missions, wrote, "By the time these events took place, the leaders of the Reich had abandoned every standard of responsible action, both toward their own people and toward the enemy. The fighter pilots were caught in the middle of this madness. Heinz Knoke's evolution was particularly striking. Early in the war, he had written, "The prospect of actually experiencing war rather appeals to me." By 1944, his tone had changed completely, recording the impossibility of their situation and the pointlessness of continued resistance against overwhelming numerical superiority. Major Heinz Baer, who ended the war with 221 victories, described the progression. "In 1940, we owned the sky. In 1941, we shared it with the RAF. By 1943, we were disputing it with the Americans. By 1944, we were merely trying to survive in it." The Messerschmitt Me-262 represented German technical superiority rendered meaningless by strategic incompetence. The world's first operational jet fighter, capable of 540 miles per hour, 100 miles per hour faster than any Allied fighter, should have changed everything. Germany produced approximately 1,430 E-262s, but Hitler's insistence on using them as bombers delayed fighter deployment until late 1944. When Galland demonstrated the Me-262, he famously remarked, It felt as though angels were pushing. Hitler asked only about bomb capacity. Even when finally permitted as fighters, fuel shortages and training deficits limited operations. Jagdgeschwader 7 could rarely put more than 30 Me-262S airborne simultaneously. Against 1,000-plane raids, even revolutionary technology proved insufficient. June 6, 1944, demonstrated the Luftwaffe's complete collapse. Despite years preparing for invasion, Luftflotte 3 had only 100 operational fighters available. Against them, the Allies launched 11,590 sorties on D-Day. The Luftwaffe managed 319 sorties total, just 35 by fighters. Josef Priller's response became legendary for its futility. The entire JG-26 had been relocated days before, leaving only Priller and wingman Heinz Wodarczyk at Lille. Ordered to attack the invasion beaches, Priller later recalled, "Attack the invasion with 2 fighters? It was insane. They made one strafing pass over Sword Beach before fleeing, effectively the Luftwaffe's daylight response to history's greatest amphibious invasion. Fighter pilot casualties reached catastrophic levels. The Luftwaffe suffered 26,800 fighter pilots killed or missing during the war. Monthly loss rates by 1944 became unsustainable. January 1944, 16.9% lost. February 1944, 18.2% lost. March 1944, 21.7% lost. April 1944, 19.8% lost. May 1944, 24.3% lost. June 1944, 25.8% lost. These percentages meant complete unit turnover every 4 months. Entire flying schools graduated directly into death. The December 1943 class from Jagdfliegerschule 5-52 newly minted fighter pilots suffered 80% casualties within 3 months. Individual units hemorrhaged pilots. Between January and June 1944, JG-26 lost 58 pilots killed, JG-2 Richthofen lost 67, JG-11 suffered 73 deaths. When Priller took command of JG-26 in January 1943, he had 23 pilots with over 100 missions. By June 1944, he had 3. German intelligence catastrophically underestimated American production. In 1942, they estimated U.S. aircraft production at 18,000. Actual was 47,836. For 1943, they estimated 30,000. Actual was 85,898. By 1944, estimates of 50,000 faced reality of 96,318. When Göring received reports of American fighters' production reaching 3,000 monthly, he burned them as propaganda. Actual production exceeded 3,600. The B-17 alone saw 12,731 produced, with Boeing's Seattle plant completing 16 daily at peak. Ford's Willow Run produced 1 B-24 every 63 minutes. German production, despite Speer's reforms, peaked at 39,807 aircraft in 1944, when neither fuel nor pilots existed to fly them. America alone produced 96,318 that year. Adding British and Soviet production created a 4-to-1 disadvantage Germany couldn't overcome. By March 1945, the Luftwaffe existed only nominally. Of 1,000-plus fighters supposedly available, perhaps 100 could fly daily. Fuel permitted 1 sortie weekly per pilot. Most pilots had under 50 hours flight time. Heinz Knoke flew his last mission on March 18, 1945. His diary captured the final reality: worn aircraft, exhausted pilots, empty fuel tanks, and the certainty of defeat. The mathematics evident since 1943 had reached their inevitable conclusion. The Luftwaffe lost approximately 76,875 aircraft during the war, including 43,000 in combat. Human losses. 165,000 aircrew killed, 155,000 wounded, 192,000 missing or captured. Against this, the 8th Air Force lost 26,000 killed from over 350,000 who served, grievous but sustainable losses. The production differential was insurmountable. In 1944 alone, the Allies produced 163,099 aircraft versus Germany's 39,807. No amount of courage could overcome such disparity. The destruction of the Luftwaffe offers enduring lessons about industrial warfare. German pilots, initially the world's best trained and most experienced, were destroyed not through lacking courage, but through mathematical inevitability. The American approach, mass production, adequate training for many sustainable losses, proved superior to German individual excellence. While German aces accumulated spectacular scores, they couldn't alter outcomes determined by production statistics. When German pilots faced those massive formations with handfuls of fighters, they witnessed industrial warfare's reality. Individual excellence, however admirable, cannot overcome systemic superiority. When industrial might reaches sufficient differential, outcomes become mathematically certain. The German fighter pilots who faced American bomber formations in 1943 to 1944 witnessed something unprecedented: complete airspace dominance through industrial might. Veterans described skies filled with silver bombers as far as eyes could see, a metallic tide that announced not just military defeat, but the end of an era. The transformation from hunter to hunted occurred with shocking speed. In 1940, German fighters swept opposition from European skies. By 1944, they could barely defend their own airfields. This wasn't gradual decline, but catastrophic collapse. The fighter pilots' revolt of January 1945 represented final acknowledgement by those who had denied reality longest. When Germany's greatest aces told Göring the truth, that the war was lost, that continuing meant pointless death, they voiced what every pilot knew. German pilots learned modern warfare's hardest lesson: individual excellence cannot overcome systemic superiority. They flew knowing they were already defeated, that their sacrifice would change nothing. They flew anyway, from duty, habit, or because they knew nothing else. In their defeat lay profound lessons about production and power, about courage's limits against material superiority. The German pilots who faced those bomber armadas didn't just lose a war, they witnessed warfare's transformation into an industrial equation with predetermined outcomes. Their testimony stands as historical witness. They fought mathematical certainty and lost, not from lacking skill or courage, but because they faced an enemy that had transformed war into industrial mathematics. The German fighter pilots of 1943 to 1945 learned in blood that when the sky fills with enough metal, individual warriors become irrelevant. The age of the ace had ended. The age of mass production had begun.